The day Mabel Walker rode into Dusty Creek, New Mexico territory, with nothing but a saddlebag full of grief and a deed to a broken-down ranch, she made herself a promise that she intended to keep for the rest of her natural life. She was done with men, done with marriage, and done with anyone who thought a woman alone was a problem that needed solving. It was the spring of 1882, and the territory was still as raw and unpredictable as a half-broke Mustang, the kind of place where the wind carried red dust into your teeth before you even had the chance to say good morning, and where the sun baked the earth so hard that the cracks in the ground looked like the lines on an old man's face. Dusty Creek sat at the edge of the Sangre de Cristo foothills, a town of maybe 300 souls if you counted generously, with a main street that had a saloon at one end, a church at the other, and the rest of life crammed somewhere in between. Mabel was 28 years old, which the women of Dusty Creek would whisper was dangerously close to being left on the shelf, though Mabel herself had long since thrown the shelf out entirely. She had brown hair the color of creek water in autumn, eyes that were a particular shade of gray-green that changed depending on her mood, and hands that were already calloused from years of hard work because she had never been the kind of woman who waited for someone else to do what needed doing. She had been married once briefly to a man named Gerald Walker, who had died of fever 2 years prior and left her with his debts, his half-formed dreams, and absolutely none of his patience. She had paid every last cent of those debts herself, sold what little remained, and used the final inheritance from her late father, a modest sum she had fought her 3 brothers in court to receive, to purchase 40 acres of scrubland outside of Dusty Creek that her father had once called promising. Promising. She turned that word over in her mind as she rode up to the property and took in the collapsed fence line, the sagging barn roof, the house that listed slightly to the left as if it had grown tired of standing straight. Promising was the kind of word men used when they meant you are going to have to do all of this yourself. She stepped down from her horse, a steady roan mare she called Juniper, and stood with her hands on her hips and looked at everything that was wrong with the place, and then she looked at the sky, which was that particular blazing blue that only exists in New Mexico in the spring, and she decided that promising was exactly right. It was going to take work. Everything worth having took work. She tied Juniper to the fence post that was still standing and went to find out what needed fixing first. The town of Dusty Creek was not entirely unfriendly to a woman on her own, but it was not entirely comfortable with her either. The general store was run by a husband and wife named Earl and Dottie Marsh, and it was Dottie who showed Mabel where everything was kept and told her the prices without making her feel like a curiosity, which Mabel appreciated enormously. Earl, for his part, kept sneaking looks at her left hand, and then at the door as if he expected a husband to come through it at any moment. When one did not materialize, he asked with the kind of tone that was trying to be helpful but was not quite making it whether she had family nearby. "No family," Mabel said pleasantly, and set a sack of flour on the counter. "Just myself." Earl cleared his throat. "A woman alone out on that Walker land, that is rough country, Miss Walker." "Mrs. Walker," she corrected, not because she was sentimental about the title but because she had earned it the hard way. "And rough country suits me fine." It was in that general store, on a Thursday morning in early April, that she first encountered Theodore Turner. She heard him before she saw him, because he had a voice that carried whether he meant it to or not, a deep, unhurried baritone that seemed to belong to a man who had never once felt the need to rush his words to make sure they landed. He was talking to Earl about fence posts, of all things, and he was talking about them with a specificity and genuine interest that told Mabel this was a man who took practical matters seriously. When she turned to look, she found a man who was roughly her own age, perhaps a year or 2 older, standing at the other end of the counter with his hat in his hands. He was tall but not unreasonably so, broad-shouldered in the way that came from years of actual labor rather than idle posturing, with dark brown hair that had been burned slightly lighter at the temples by the sun, and a face that was weathered enough to be interesting but not so weathered as to be hard. He had what Mabel would privately describe, much later, as a thinking man's face, the kind where you could tell the thoughts were happening behind the eyes even when the expression stayed still. He must have felt her looking because he turned, and for a half-second they simply looked at each other in the direct, unsentimental way of two people who had both stopped performing pleasantries for strangers. Then he gave a small nod, and she gave a small nod, and they both looked away. That should have been the end of it. It was not the end of it, because Dusty Creek was a small town, and small towns have a particular talent for throwing the same people together repeatedly until something happens between them. The second time she saw Theodore Turner was 2 days later, when she was attempting to convince her new neighbor, a grizzled rancher named Horace Depp, that the fence line between their properties had been wrongly surveyed and that approximately 12 feet of what Horace was claiming belonged to her. The argument had been going on for 20 minutes and had reached the stage where both parties had stopped being polite about it, and Mabel was standing on her side of the disputed line with her arms crossed, speaking in the level, precise tone she used when she was extremely angry and had decided that showing it would only give the other person satisfaction. "Mrs. Walker," Horace was saying, "I have run cattle on this land for 11 years, and I know where my fence sits." "Then you have been sitting it 12 feet over onto my property for 11 years, Mabel said. "I have the survey map. I'm happy to walk it with you if you need the demonstration. Now look here." "Is there a problem, Horace?" The new voice came from the road, and both of them looked up to find Theodore Turner sitting on a paint horse, looking down at them with an expression of mild, polite inquiry that somehow managed to be completely neutral without being dismissive. Horace's expression changed slightly. "Turner, no problem. Just a discussion with my new neighbor." "It did not sound entirely like a discussion," Theodore said, still in that same unhurried way. "Mrs. Walker," Mabel said, deciding that since he had appeared she might as well use him. "Mabel Walker, I own the 40 acres south of Mr. Depp's property. He and I are disagreeing about where south ends and his property begins." Theodore looked from her to Horace and back again. "You have the deed survey. Right here." She held it up. He swung down from his horse with the ease of a man who had been doing it since childhood and walked over, and she handed him the map, and he looked at it for a long, quiet moment, then looked at the fence line, then looked back at the map. "Horace," he said, not unkindly, "I think she may be right." Horace sputtered for a while and then, with the deeply unhappy air of a man who has been shown the facts and does not like them, said he would have his own man look at it, and that he was not saying she was wrong, but he was not saying she was right either, and then he went back across his property with the particular gait of a man who is trying to look dignified while retreating. Theodore handed her the survey map back. "He will come around," he said. "He is a fair man underneath the stubbornness." "I do not require him to come around," Mabel said. "I require him to acknowledge the property line." Something shifted in Theodore's expression, and she realized after a moment that he was suppressing a smile. "Those are two different things," he agreed. "Yes," she said, "they are." He put his hat back on. "Theodore Turner, I run cattle on the land about a mile east of here. If you need the fence line witnessed, I am available." "I will manage," she said, which was not unfriendly exactly but was firm. He nodded. "I expect you will," he said, and got back on his horse and rode east, and Mabel watched him go with the distinct sensation of a woman who is being very careful with herself. She was very careful for approximately 3 weeks. In those 3 weeks, she repaired the barn roof with the help of 2 men she hired from town, dug out the old kitchen garden, and put in seeds she had brought with her from her previous home in Santa Fe, fixed the fence line herself using the post she had hauled out from Earl's store in a borrowed wagon, and established a reputation in Dusty Creek for being competent, civil, and entirely self-sufficient. She took her meals alone and kept her own counsel, and went to the Sunday service at the small Methodist church on the main street, because it seemed like the practical thing to do in a new community. not because she had any particular spiritual urgency about the matter. It was at the Sunday service on the third week that she found herself seated 3 pews behind Theodore Turner, who was there with his hired hand, a young Mexican man named Luis Ortega, and she had ample opportunity during what turned out to be a very long sermon about the virtues of patience to observe that Theodore Turner sat very still during sermons, did not fidget the way most men did, and appeared to be genuinely listening. She found this more interesting than she wanted to. After the service, standing in the pale spring sunshine outside the church, the town doing its weekly ritual of catching up and exchanging news, Reverend Aldous made a point of introducing everyone to Mabel, which meant she was trapped in a circle of handshakes and how-do-you-dos for a solid quarter-hour. When she finally extracted herself, she nearly walked directly into Theodore, who was standing just outside the circle with Louis, waiting, apparently, to say something to the Reverend. "Mrs. Walker," he said, stepping back to give her room. "Mr. Turner," she said, "how is the property shaping up?" "Well enough," she said. There was a pause that was not entirely uncomfortable, which Mabel noted and then tried not to note. "I have been meaning to mention," he said, "that the creek that runs along the southern edge of your property, it goes dry in July usually, but there is a spring on the east pasture of my land that I have been thinking about digging out proper. If I do, the water runs downhill your direction. It might help your summer grazing." She looked at him. "Why would you do that?" "Because it would benefit both of us," he said, with a simplicity that made the answer sound entirely obvious. "Good water does not stop at property lines, and you would want nothing in return." He seemed to think about this honestly rather than just dismissing the question, which she respected. "I would want the understanding that if I am doing work that benefits you, you would not put up any impediment to the water flow. That is all." "That seems reasonable," she said carefully. "Good," he said, and there was that suppressed smile quality again around his eyes. "I will let you know when I begin the work." He went to speak to the Reverend, and Mabel walked to where Juniper was tied, and she stood there for a moment longer than necessary, looking at nothing in particular, thinking about a man who talked about water flow like it was a kind of conversation. The spring digging happened in early May, and Theodore did it with Louis and one other hired hand without making any production of it, and by mid-May, there was a reliable trickle of water moving along the edge of Mabel's south pasture that had not been there before. She went out in the early morning to look at it, kneeling down and putting her fingers in the cold, clear water, and felt something move in her chest that she firmly identified as gratitude and left it that. She baked a pie. She had always been a good baker, which was one of those things she never said about herself but which was simply true, and she made an apple pie with the dried apples she had stored all winter in Santa Fe, with cinnamon and a touch of molasses in the filling, and a crust that was exactly right. She wrapped it in a cloth and rode east on Juniper on a Wednesday afternoon, with the pie balanced carefully across her lap, and the story she was telling herself being that this was simple neighborly courtesy and nothing more. Theodore was at his barn when she arrived, working on a piece of harness leather that had cracked, bent over a workbench with his sleeves rolled to the elbow, and the particular focused expression of a man engaged with a problem he finds satisfying to solve. He looked up when he heard Juniper's hooves and stood straight and waited. She dismounted and held out the pie. "For the water work," she said. He looked at the pie for a moment, then at her. "You did not have to do that." "I know I did not have to," she said. "That is why I did it." He took the pie carefully, as if it was something worth taking care of, and set it on the workbench, and looked at her again with that same quality of direct attention that she had noticed the first time and had been noticing ever since. "Have you had supper?" he asked. "Not yet. I have a pot of beans and some cornbread. It is not a pie," he said, "but it is hot if you want it." She should have said no. She had told herself, in very clear terms, in the privacy of her own head, and in the long, honest conversations she had with herself in the early mornings when the world was still dark and quiet, and she could be entirely truthful about things, that she was not in the market for a husband, was not interested in any of the particular complications that came with being interested in a man, and that the 40 acres and the work needed to make them into something real was more than enough to fill a life. "All right," she said. She ate supper at Theodore Turner's table for the first time on a Wednesday evening in May of 1882, and the beans were good and the cornbread was better, and they talked about water rights and grazing patterns and the price of cattle in Albuquerque, which were all perfectly practical and impersonal topics. And yet by the time she rode home in the blue-gray dusk with the coyotes beginning their distant conversation in the hills, she was aware of a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the beans. She rode home, put Juniper in the barn, went inside, sat down at her small kitchen table, and had a very stern conversation with herself that lasted approximately 5 minutes and accomplished almost nothing. Over the following weeks, the neighborly arrangement between them developed the way that water develops its course, not with any deliberate planning, but with the steady logic of things finding the way they want to go. He came to help when one of her fence sections blew down in a late spring storm, arriving with tools and Lewis before she had even finished assessing the damage, and they worked side by side for 3 hours in the strong May wind, and she noticed the way he worked, efficient and unshowy, doing the thing that needed doing without requiring anyone to observe him doing it. She helped him in return when the following week one of his herd broke a leg in a gully, and he needed an extra set of hands for the difficult business of dealing with the situation. And she did what needed to be done without flinching, because the frontier did not accommodate flinching, and she had understood that a long time ago. They fell into a rhythm of Thursday suppers that neither of them had exactly proposed. It had simply happened that on the second Thursday after the first supper, she had come by to return a tool she had borrowed, and it had been supper time, and he had had extra stew, and by the fourth Thursday it was simply understood between them, in the way that certain things become understood between people who are paying attention to each other. On the sixth Thursday, sitting on his porch after supper in the long golden light of a June evening, watching the swallows do their elaborate evening business over the pasture, he said, without particular preamble, "What brings you out here? To this country, I mean. You do not strike me as a woman with nowhere else to go." She was quiet for a moment, weighing how much of the truth to give. "My father owned this land when I was a girl," she said. "He never got to do anything with it. He gave it to me in his will, but my brothers contested it, and by the time the court was done with it, there was almost nothing left to come to. But the land was still there." She paused. "I wanted to build something that was mine." "Yours alone," he said, not as an accusation, just as a thing he was clarifying. "Yes," she said, "mine alone." He nodded slowly. In the evening quiet, a meadowlark was singing somewhere in the tall grass. "I understand that," he said finally. "What about you?" she asked, because it seemed only fair. "You have been here a while, I take it." 7 years, he said. "I came out from Tennessee after the war, well, after the years after the war, which were in some ways worse. My family had land but not much else, and I wanted somewhere that was not already decided." He turned his hat in his hands, something she had noticed he did when he was thinking. "I wanted to see if I could make something from nothing, and have you." He smiled, finally letting the smile be a real one instead of the restrained thing he usually kept it to, and it changed his face entirely, made him look younger and less careful. "Working on it," he said. She looked at him looking at the pasture, and she felt something shift very quietly somewhere deep in her chest, something she did not immediately know the name of, and she deliberately looked away and watched the swallows instead. There was a man in town named Cole Barker, who had been making Mabel uneasy since approximately her 3rd week in Dusty Creek. He was the kind of man who stood too close and spoke too loud, and had the particular confidence of someone who had never been told no by anyone whose opinion he respected. He ran a gambling operation out of the back of the saloon, and had several men who appeared to work for him in various capacities, and he had made it known through the indirect channels of small-town conversation that he was interested in acquiring more land in the valley, particularly land with water access. Mabel's 40 acres, with the new spring water flowing along the south pasture, had water access. She became aware of his specific interest in her property on a Saturday morning in late June when she found one of his men, a thick-armed individual named Burl, standing on her side of the fence line she had established with Horace Depp, looking at her south pasture with the proprietary air of someone assessing something he intends to acquire. "You are on my property," she said, walking toward him with the measured pace of someone who is not afraid, but is also not going to pretend the situation is acceptable. Burl turned and looked at her with a kind of lazy insolence that she found enormously irritating. "Mr. Barker asked me to take a look at the land. He is considering making you an offer." "Mr. Barker can save himself the trouble," Mabel said. "This land is not for sale. Everything is for sale at the right price, ma'am." "Get off my property," she said. "Now." He went, but he went slowly and with a smile that she did not like the shape of. She told Theodore about it the following Thursday, not because she needed him to solve it, but because she had found, over the past 2 months, that telling him things was becoming a natural impulse, one she was still occasionally arguing with but winning less frequently. He listened without interrupting, which was one of the things she valued most about talking to him. He actually listened, did not start planning his response halfway through what she was saying. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Cole Barker is not a man who takes no well," he said. "I am not a woman who changes her no," she said. "I know that," he said, and there was something in his voice when he said it that was not quite admiration but was adjacent to it, a kind of warm recognition. "But you should know that he has done this before. There was a family east of here, the Petersons, couple of years back. He made offers, they refused, and then they started having trouble. Fence lines damaged, cattle going missing, nothing you could prove he was behind." Mabel felt the particular cold clarity of someone whose suspicion has just been confirmed. "I see. I am not saying it to frighten you," he said. "I am saying it because you should be aware of what you may be dealing with." "Thank you," she said. "I am aware." He looked at her steadily. "If anything happens, you will tell me." It was not quite a question, but it had enough question in it to require an answer. She looked back at him and felt the particular complicated feeling she had been feeling with increasing frequency over the past weeks, the one that was made of equal parts gratitude and resistance, and something else she was still being very careful not to name. "I will," she said. The trouble with Cole Barker began in earnest in July, when the summer heat had settled over the territory like a wool blanket, the kind of heat that turns the horizon into a shimmer and makes every task twice as effortful. She found her south fence cut clean through on a Monday morning, the wire lying coiled on the ground as if someone had done the work with deliberate neatness, wanting her to know it was a choice and not an accident. Her cattle, she had 8 head, modest, but hers were gone from the south pasture. She found them 3 hours later, wandering on Barker's land to the west, apparently having been herded there through the gap in her fence. She rode to Dusty Creek and went directly to the sheriff's office, which was occupied by a man named Tom Greer, who was not a bad man but who had the particular quality of a man who preferred situations to resolve themselves without his involvement. He listened to her, wrote things down, said he would look into it, and she left with the clear-eyed understanding that looking into it was not the same as doing anything about it. She went to collect her cattle herself, riding onto Barker's land with a directness that she could tell surprised the hands working there, and she cut her cattle out of his herd with a competence that she was quietly pleased about because she had spent the last 2 months practicing exactly this, and she drove them home and repaired her fence herself that evening. Theodore rode up while she was still working on it in the dusty late afternoon light, and without a word swung down from his horse and took the other end of the wire she was struggling to stretch. "You do not have to," she started. "I know I do not have to," he said, with the same quiet echo of what she had said about the pie 2 months ago, and she felt something catch in her throat. They fixed the fence together in a silence that was full rather than empty, and when they were done and she had thanked him and he was getting back on his horse, he paused with one foot in the stirrup and looked at her. "I have been thinking," he said, with the careful tone of a man who has been thinking about how to say something for a while. "About what?" she said. "About whether you would like to have supper in town on Saturday," he said. "At the hotel dining room, not a Thursday supper on the porch, an actual supper." The distinction he was drawing was entirely clear to both of them. She looked at him in the fading light and felt everything she had been being careful about shift and press against the inside of her chest. "Theodore," she said, "I am not looking for a husband." He looked at her for a long, steady moment. "Mabel," he said, "I am not looking for a wife either." The silence between them was enormous and full of something she could not quite get her arms around. "And yet," he said quietly, "here we are." She stood there with the wire pliers in her hand, and the evening sky going pink behind the mountains and the particular quality of that moment settling around her like something she was going to remember the texture of for the rest of her life. "Saturday," she said. "What time?" She was not certain, afterward, exactly when she had stopped being careful. She thought perhaps it had been happening in increments so small that each individual one was manageable. The way a river changes its course slowly enough that you do not notice until you look up and realize you are somewhere entirely different from where you started. The Saturday supper at the hotel dining room was the first time she had dressed with any care since arriving in Dusty Creek, and she stood before the small mirror in her bedroom in the blue dress she had brought from Santa Fe and had barely worn, and looked at herself with the same direct, assessing gaze she used on fence lines and survey maps. She looked like herself, she decided, which was the best she could do and the only thing she wanted. He was waiting outside the hotel when she walked down the main street, and she watched him see her from half a block away, watched the particular quality of attention that came into his face, and then was very quickly and deliberately composed into something more neutral. And she found that the thing he had tried to contain and the effort of containing it were both equally interesting to her. He had made an effort himself. His hat was new or newly brushed, and he had shaved and was wearing a jacket that fit him properly, and there was something about seeing Theodore Turner in a jacket that she was not quite prepared for. "You look," he started, and then stopped, as if the sentence had arrived somewhere he had not anticipated. "Thank you," she said, deciding to spare him the rest of it. "I did not finish," he said. "I know," she said. "You looked like you needed a moment." He looked at her with that expression she had come to think of as his real expression, the one underneath the composed version, the one that was warmer and more surprised by things than he usually let on. "You are going to be very interesting to know, Mabel Walker," he said. "I expect I am," she agreed. The dining room at the Creek Hotel was not elegant, but it was the best available for 60 miles in any direction, which meant it had actual tablecloths and a man who came around with a pitcher of water and a menu written on a chalkboard. They ate roast chicken and potatoes, and there was a pie for dessert that was not as good as hers, a fact she noted privately and magnanimously decided not to mention. They talked for 2 hours without running out of things to say, which told her more than the conversation itself. He had read widely, for a man whose life was cattle and land and the particular physical demands of the frontier, and he had opinions about things that were neither reflexive nor performative. He had actually thought about them, which was so rare in her experience that she kept catching herself delighted by it. He told her about his family in Tennessee, 2 sisters, both married, a mother who had died the previous year, a father he had not spoken to in 5 years over a disagreement about the land that had grown into something neither of them could seem to cross. She heard the weight of that in his voice without making him explain it, and she told him about her own father, who had been a man of great enthusiasms and small follow-through, who had loved his children extravagantly but never quite remembered to protect them from the practical consequences of his choices, and who had died owning this 40 acres in New Mexico and a memory of a promise he had never quite fulfilled. "But you are fulfilling it," Theodore said. "I am trying to," she said. "That is more than most people manage," he said, "trying to finish someone else's dream." "It is my dream too," she said. "Now." He looked at her across the table in the lamplight with the expression he usually tried to conceal and tonight was making less effort to, and she let herself look back, and neither of them said anything for a moment, and the moment had a weight to it that was not uncomfortable in the least. The trouble with Barker escalated in August. She woke at 3 in the morning to Juniper making noise in the barn, the kind of urgent, alarmed sound that meant something was wrong, and she was out of bed and had her rifle in her hands before she was fully awake, because that was the kind of woman the territory had made her. She went to the window first. She was not reckless, and in the moonlight she could see 2 figures moving near her barn. She fired the rifle out the window, aimed deliberately at the sky, and shouted that the next one would be lower. The 2 figures ran. She did not sleep again that night, sitting at the kitchen table with the rifle across her knees and a lamp burning until the first gray light came up over the mountains. She told Theodore in the morning, riding east at first light and finding him already in his pasture checking his herd. He listened with the still expression he used when he was very angry and not showing it, and then he said, "We need to talk to Tom Greer. Together." Together," he said. "It is different. I do not like that it is different, but it is." She knew he was right, and the knowing of it sat with a complicated weight in her chest, the frustration of living in a world where a woman's word alone was insufficient, and the specific gratitude that the person offering to supplement it was doing so without making her feel diminished by the need. They rode to Dusty Creek together and stood in front of Tom Greer's desk, and between them laid out everything they knew: the fence cutting, the cattle herding, the night visitors, and Theodore said, in the measured way he had of saying things that were not requests, that if Barker's men were on Mrs. Walker's property again, he would personally bring whichever ones he caught to this office, and that the sheriff might want to consider whether his own position in this town rested on his willingness to enforce the law for women alone as readily as for anyone else. Tom Greer, to his credit, read and then wrote several things in his ledger and said he would speak to Barker directly. Whether it was Greer's conversation with Barker or something else, the direct harassment stopped after that. Barker, when she encountered him on the main street 2 weeks later, looked at her with the flat assessment of a man who is recalculating rather than retreating, and she returned his look with the direct gaze of a woman who has no retreat in her. And then she went on with her errands and did not give him the satisfaction of a second thought. The summer moved through its burning months and into the gentler gold of September, and the territory put on its autumn display of color in the hills, the aspens going yellow, the scrub oak turning a deep rust red, the sky at evening doing extraordinary things in orange and purple that she had never been able to adequately describe to anyone who had not seen them. She and Theodore had stopped being careful with each other in the way that acquaintances are careful, though they were still careful in the particular way of 2 people who have both been hurt by carelessness in the past, and have decided that the careful approach is a form of respect rather than distance. He kissed her for the first time on an evening in late September, standing at the gate of her property after he had ridden her home from a supper in town, and it was not impulsive or sudden. She saw it coming in the quality of stillness that came over him, and she let it come, and it was gentle and certain, and tasted like the particular sweet seriousness of something that had been thought about for a long time. Afterward she stood with her hand on the gate and looked at him in the early dark, and he looked back, and neither of them said anything immediately, and then she said, "I meant what I said about not looking for a husband." "I know," he said. "I want to be clear that I am saying this while also saying that I would like you to do that again," she said. A real, full smile broke across his face. "I am glad to hear that," he said. "I just want us to understand each other," she said. "I think I understand you better than I have understood anyone in a long time," he said. "And I am not in a hurry. We will figure it out as we go." It was exactly the right thing to say, and she knew it. And she thought that perhaps the most important thing she had learned about Theodore Turner over these months was that he almost always said the exactly right thing, not because he was performing at being right, but because he was genuinely paying attention, and the rightness came from that. The autumn brought new business, as seasons always do. Mabel's garden had produced well despite everything, the late planting and the summer heat and the worry over Barker, and she spent days putting things up, filling the root cellar with potatoes and dried beans, and the sealed jars of tomatoes and peaches and apple butter that represented her winter preparedness in physical form. Theodore came by on weekends to help with the heavier work, and she went to help him when the cattle needed to be moved to the lower pasture for winter. And they worked together with the comfortable efficiency of two people who have figured out how the other one moves and thinks. Luis Ortega, who had become something of a fixture in the general orbit of both their lives, said one afternoon while the three of them were building a new section of corral, with the oblique casualness of someone who is making a point while appearing not to, "My grandmother says that when two people can work together without talking about every step, it means they have already decided something they have not said yet." There was a silence. "Your grandmother sounds wise," Mabel said. "She is," Louis said, driving a nail with great concentration. Theodore, on the other side of the corral post, met her eyes over the top of it, and the look that went between them was the kind that people who are very much falling in love share, when they are not yet ready to say so directly, but cannot quite prevent it from being visible. The winter of 1882 came early and cold, the way New Mexico winters occasionally did when the weather up in the mountains decided to come down and share itself with everyone. By December the nights were hard, and the water in the troughs was freezing before morning, and Mabel's small house with its fieldstone fireplace became the center of her world in the way that all homes become their own universe in winter. Theodore made a habit of riding over on Sunday afternoons and staying through supper and into the evening, sitting at her kitchen table with a book he had brought from his own small library, and she would bake or read or do the mending that always accumulated, and the silence between them was the specific, rare silence of two people who are comfortable enough with each other to simply exist in the same space without filling it. One Sunday evening in December, she put down the book she was reading and looked at him across the table where he was working through a survey of land values he had been studying for some purchase he was considering, and she said, "I am in love with you." He looked up. "I thought I should just say it," she said, rather than continue the prolonged business of almost saying it. He set the survey papers down. He looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, which was saying something because she had been paying close attention for months. It was open in a way his face very rarely was, open and careful at once, the expression of someone who has been waiting for something and is not quite sure how to receive it now that it has arrived. "Mabel," he said, "you do not have to match it immediately," she said. "I know you are more deliberate than I am about saying things." "No," he said, and stood up from the table. "That is not what I am doing." He came around the table and she stood up too, and he took both of her hands in his in the careful, genuine way he did most things. And he said, "I have been in love with you since approximately the third Thursday supper, when you argued with me about the correct method for winterproofing a root cellar for 20 minutes and were entirely right about all of it." She laughed, which was not what she expected to do, and then he was laughing too, and it was the best kind of laughter, the kind that comes from the collision of relief and joy. He kissed her, and she kissed him back, and the winter wind did its business outside against the windows, and inside the stone fireplace did its work, and Mabel Walker stood in the kitchen of the house that was hers, on the land that was hers, holding the hands of a man she had told herself she did not want and who had very quietly, and without any fuss, become one of the most necessary things in her life. The new year of 1883 arrived with the particular brightness of a territory winter day. The sky, a violent blue, and the distant mountains white with snow, and the whole world looking cleaned and deliberate. Theodore proposed to her in February, in the direct, untheatrical way that was entirely characteristic of him, not on bended knee in any public place, but standing in her kitchen on a Thursday evening after supper with no more preamble than saying her name, and then, when she looked up, "I know you told me you were not looking for a husband." "I did say that," she agreed. "And I said I was not looking for a wife," he said. "You did. And yet here we are." She looked at him, this man who had shown up at every difficult thing with tools in his hands and his sleeves rolled up and never once tried to make her small to fit into a space he found comfortable, and she felt the full weight of the "here we are" land inside her chest. "Here we are," she said softly. "I am not asking you to be anything other than exactly what you are," he said. "The land is yours. That does not change. The work you have done is yours. That does not change. I am just asking if you would like to do this, all of it with me, as a choice, not an obligation." She came around the kitchen table and stood in front of him and looked at his face, which was weathered and honest, and looking back at her with the same directness she had been drawn to from the first moment, and she said, "Yes." The wedding was in April of 1883, a year almost to the month after she had ridden into Dusty Creek with her saddlebag and her grief and her promises to herself. It was a small affair, because neither of them wanted anything large. The Reverend at the Methodist Church, Dottie and Earl from the general store, Louis Ortega and his young wife Maria, who had come to Dusty Creek the previous autumn, and Horace Depp, who had by then acknowledged the property line and had become, in the grudging way of difficult neighbors who eventually come around, something close to a friend. Mabel wore the blue dress again, the one from Santa Fe, with her hair down properly and the pair of pearl earrings that had been her mother's, and she walked to the church herself and was not given away by anyone, because she was a woman who had always given herself. Theodore was at the altar in his good jacket with a serious expression that kept being broken by the smile he could not quite contain, and when she came through the door and he saw her, the serious expression gave up entirely, and he smiled at her the full, open smile that she had come to think of as his private one, the one he did not often show to the world, and her chest was so full of feeling that she thought it might be visible from the outside. The Reverend spoke about partnership and patience and the particular courage of two people who choose each other deliberately, and Mabel thought that he had somehow managed to say exactly the right things without either of them having asked him to. After the ceremony, they had a supper at the hotel dining room, the same table where they had sat on their first real supper, which neither of them mentioned but both of them noticed, and Louis made a toast in Spanish and then in English, and Dottie cried a little bit, and Horace made a speech about the importance of good fences that was both literal and somehow entirely appropriate. Later that evening, riding home together on Juniper and Theodore's paint horse under a sky so thick with stars it was almost intimidating, Mabel said, "I want to keep the name Walker." "Your name," he said with no pause and no protest. "I will add Turner," she said, "but I want to keep Walker." "Mabel Walker Turner," he said, trying it. "That sounds like a woman who means what she says." "It does," she agreed. He reached over from his horse and took her hand, which was a slightly awkward maneuver involving considerable balance, and she laughed and held on. The spring of 1883 was kind to them. Mabel's garden went in early and well. Theodore's cattle herd expanded by 12 head with a good calving season, and the water from the spring ran clear and consistent along the south pasture in a way that made the whole operation feel like it was building toward something real. They decided to build properly, not just maintain the existing house but expand it, because they were two people now and intended to be more, and the listing little house that had seemed like enough for one woman was not quite enough for two people who both needed space to think and to be. Theodore drew up the plans himself over the winter, and they argued pleasantly about every detail. She wanted more windows. He wanted more stone in the foundation. She won on the windows and he won on the foundation, and they were both right. and by May the framing was up, and by July there was a real house with a porch on 3 sides and windows that looked east toward the mountains and let in the morning light that Mabel had always thought was the best kind. Luis and Maria Ortega came to help with the building, and other neighbors came too, because the territory had this quality of communal work that Mabel had not fully understood before she arrived, but had come to value enormously. The understanding that a person's house was also everyone's responsibility to help build, because everyone's house might need building at some point. Cole Barker had been a diminishing presence since the previous year's confrontations, but in August of 1883, he made one final attempt, this time legal rather than physical. He brought a claim against the original survey of Mabel's property to the territorial court in Santa Fe, arguing that the 40 acres had been improperly filed, and that a portion of it, including the south pasture with the spring water, belonged to him under an earlier claim he had held on the general area. It was the kind of legal maneuvering that wore people down, and Mabel suspected that was the point, that even if he could not win outright, he could cost her enough in time and worry and legal fees to make her want to leave. She did not want to leave. Theodore said, with the calm certainty of a man who has decided something and is done deciding, that they would fight it properly, and he knew a lawyer in Santa Fe who was honest and good, which was not the most common combination, but existed if you knew where to look. He said this as one half of the we she had only recently started taking entirely for granted, and she squeezed his hand and said that she would write to him immediately. The lawyer, a small, precise man named Arthur Holloway who wore a vest even in the heat of August, came to Dusty Creek, reviewed the documents, listened to everything Mabel told him about the chain of title from her father, and said, with the dry confidence of a man who has been doing this for a long time, that Barker's claim would not hold, and that the filing of it was itself potentially actionable as a harassment of title. He said this last part while looking at his papers rather than at Barker's man who had come to observe, and the looking at papers quality of it was, Mabel thought, its own kind of message. The case was resolved by October, Barker's claim dismissed by the territorial court, with a notation that the original survey was valid, and that further challenges to the same title would be taken as evidence of bad faith. It was the kind of outcome that closed the door completely, and Mabel sat with the letter from Arthur Holloway on a cool October morning at the kitchen table in the new house, and read it twice, and then set it down, and looked out the east-facing window at the mountains, and felt the particular quality of relief that is so deep it is almost indistinguishable from peace. Theodore came in from the barn and found her sitting like that and looked at her face and said, "Good news." "Very good news," she said. He poured himself coffee from the pot on the stove and sat down across from her, and she handed him the letter and he read it and then set it down and looked at her across the table. "It is done," he said. "It is done," she agreed. Something in both of them relaxed completely, something that had been held slightly ready for the next difficulty, and the morning in the new kitchen with the light coming in the east windows was entirely, perfectly ordinary, and it was the best thing in the world. Cole Barker left Dusty Creek by the end of that year, apparently having found that the combination of legal defeat and a community that had watched his methods and formed its own opinion made the territory less hospitable than he had expected. No one in Dusty Creek was visibly sorry to see him go, though Mabel did not celebrate his departure because she had found, in her experience, that celebrating other people's misfortunes had a habit of turning the taste of your own good fortune. The winter of 1883 was their first full winter together in the new house, and it had a quality she had never had before in any winter she could remember, the specific warmth of being in the right place, with the right person, inside the walls of something she had helped to build. She had not known, she thought, how much of the cold of previous winters had been loneliness, not until she was warm in a way that she had not previously been warm. She discovered in November that she was expecting, and told Theodore on a Sunday evening in the kitchen while he was reading, and she was doing absolutely nothing, just sitting, which was something she had only recently allowed herself to do. He looked up from his book. He looked at her for a long moment with an expression that went through several stages, starting with the stillness that meant he was taking in information that was important, moving through something that was pure surprise, and arriving at the expression she would remember the rest of her life, which was the full, open, terrified, radiant look of a man who has just understood that his life is going to become something larger than he expected. "Are you certain?" he said. "Quite certain," she said. He put the book down carefully, as if it mattered how he set it down, and came to where she was sitting and knelt beside her chair in a way that was not theatrical but simply the natural expression of someone who needs to be close to something important, and took her hand, and she looked at him, and he looked at her, and they stayed like that for a while in the quiet house. "I am going to be," he started and stopped. "Are you frightened?" He asked because that was always his first instinct, to ask how she was before he said how he was. "A little," she said honestly. "Are you?" "Enormously," he said, with a straightforwardness that made her laugh. "Good," she said. "I think you should be." It is the appropriate response. The winter passed in the ordinary, extraordinary way of a winter during a first pregnancy, the body doing its inscrutable work, while the world outside went about the business of being cold and quiet. Mabel continued her own work. The ranch did not maintain itself, and she had never been the kind of woman who treated pregnancy as an illness. But she was also learning, slowly and with some resistance, the art of accepting help without resentment, and Theodore was very good at offering help in ways that looked like practical efficiency rather than assistance, which made it much easier to accept. He was attentive in all the particular small ways that she had come to understand were his natural mode, noticing things, doing the thing that needed doing without announcement, being present in a way that was solid and undemanding. He had a way of being in a room that she had come to find as natural as weather, and she thought about this sometimes late at night, listening to him breathe in the dark. This man she had not been looking for, who had also not been looking, and the extraordinary dumb luck, or the specific rightness, of the fact that they had found each other anyway. Louis and Maria had their first child in January of 1884, a boy they named Rodrigo, and Mabel held the infant in the small, overcrowded, joyful kitchen of their home, and felt the mixture of feelings that other people's babies produced in a woman who was expecting her own tenderness and terror, and a fierce, protective love for something that was not even entirely real to her yet. Theodore's expression when he looked at the Ortega baby was something she tucked away to think about later. Her own labor came in June, a full early summer day that started very early in the morning and lasted the length of the day, and it was attended by the town's doctor, a small Scottish woman named Dr. Agnes Forrest, who had arrived in Dusty Creek the previous year to the collective amazement and eventual gratitude of the community, and by Maria Ortega, who had recently been through the same business herself and was bracingly practical and warm in equal measure. Theodore was outside. She had sent him outside firmly, because the doctor had a rule about it, and because she had also privately judged that watching would not be good for him. She could hear him pacing occasionally, the floorboards of the new porch registering his movement, and she found this intermittently funny and entirely dear. The baby was a boy. He had Theodore's dark hair and her gray-green eyes, and the specific expression of complete ferocious outrage that all newborns wear, as if the world had been highly misrepresented in advance. Theodore came in when the doctor brought him in, and stood in the doorway of the bedroom for a moment, looking at her in the bed holding the baby, and Mabel thought she had never seen anyone look the way he looked at that moment. The expression of a man whose life has just become definitively itself. Everything that mattered arranged into the specific shape it was always going to take. He came to the bed and sat down carefully, and she put the baby into his arms and watched him hold his son for the first time with the same steady, deliberate care he gave to everything that was important. And the expression on his face was something she was going to carry with her until the last day of her own life. "He has your eyes," Theodore said, not looking up from the baby. "He has your hair," she said. "What do we call him?" They had discussed names at length and indecisively over the months and had not fully resolved the question. And now, with the baby present and requiring a name as a practical matter, she looked at Theodore and said, "You choose." He looked up at her with an expression of mild startlement. "You are letting me choose." "I made the body," she said. "You can make the name." He looked back at the baby. "James," he said after a moment, "for your father if you want it." Her father's name had been James Walker, and she had not said this, and he had somehow worked it out from things she had told him, and she felt the particular quality of being entirely known by someone, the kind that should be frightening and was instead the safest feeling she had ever had. "James," she said, and it was both an agreement and a word that tasted like her father, like the deed, like the 40 acres, like the fulfillment of the promise. James Turner. She gave him Turner as his name because that was what she and Theodore both were, even if she kept her own full Walker. Turner was, predictably, an enormous amount of work and an enormous amount of joy, and the first year of his life was one of the fullest years of Mabel's full life. The ranch grew alongside him. Mabel had been saving carefully and had added 10 more acres on the eastern edge of the property in the spring of 1885, land that was good for growing, and that she intended to put to hay for winter feed, which would reduce the cost they spent buying it in from elsewhere. Theodore's cattle operation was up to 60 head and producing steadily, and they were in the process of putting by enough capital to build a proper barn on the expanded property, one with stalls enough for the horses and the milk cow, and the small menagerie of animals that James had been accumulating since he was old enough to toddle after things. Horace Depp had a daughter named Clara who was 16 and had become a reliable fixture around Mabel's kitchen and garden, one of those practical arrangements that benefited both families. Clara got experience and independence, Mabel got reliable help, and genuinely enjoyed the girl's company. Clara was the kind of girl who asked questions that deserved real answers, and Mabel gave them to her straight, about everything from gardening to property law to what a woman needed to know to manage her own life, because she had not had anyone to tell her those things when she was 16, and she thought the lack of it had cost her something. Theodore noticed this and said, one evening while they were sitting on the porch after supper and Clara had gone home across the field, "You are teaching her." "Of course I am," Mabel said. "Not just the cooking," he said. "Definitely not just the cooking," she agreed. He was quiet for a moment in the particular satisfied way he had when things were as they should be. James was inside, asleep. The summer evening was soft and the fireflies were starting in the tall grass at the edge of the pasture, and the mountains to the east were going deep purple in the last of the light. "I have been thinking," Theodore said. "That is generally a reliable sign that something interesting is coming," she said. "I have been thinking about writing to my father," he said. She kept very still. She had known about the estrangement, had known it was something he carried like a stone in his pocket, heavier than he showed. She had not pushed at it because she understood that some things only move when they are ready to move. "What made you think of it now?" she said. "James, partly," he said, "and partly the idea that he has a grandchild he does not know, and partly," he paused, "I have been watching you build something with what you had from your own father, the land, the promise of it, and I think I have been letting something go bad through neglect when it might not have to. Do you want to repair it?" She asked because she needed to know whether it was a thing he wanted or a thing he thought he should want, because those were entirely different situations. "I think I do," he said. "I'm not certain it is possible, but I think I want to try." "Then write the letter," she said. He wrote it that week, at the kitchen table on a Sunday night after James was in bed, 3 pages in his careful, precise handwriting, and he read it to her before he sealed it, not asking for approval but sharing it. And she sat and listened and thought about the particular courage it took to be the first to reach across a silence that had lasted 5 years. His father wrote back in September, a shorter letter, less eloquent but sincere, and the correspondence began. By the following spring, Theodore's father and one of his sisters had made the long journey from Tennessee, and Mabel met them on a May afternoon that was bright and slightly windy, and had the quality of significant occasions. And she shook the old man's hand and looked at him and found a version of Theodore that was older and wearier but recognizable. The same quality of eyes, the same stillness. James toddled forward and grabbed the old man's finger, with the absolute and unconscious confidence of a child who does not know about estrangements. And Theodore Turner Sr. looked down at his grandson and said something under his breath that Mabel could not quite hear. And then he looked at his son, and there was something in that look that put a thing to rest. That evening, after the family had settled in and supper was done, and the long Tennessee visit was well begun, Mabel stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the dark pasture, and felt the full inventory of everything she had. The house and the land and the cattle and the garden and the boy, asleep down the hall and the man talking with his father in the sitting room, and all of it built from nothing. From a deed and a grief and a promise and the steady incremental miracle of showing up every day and doing the work. Theodore came into the kitchen later when the house had quieted and found her still at the window. "You all right?" he said. "Better than all right," she said. He put his arms around her from behind, the way he did when he was feeling something he did not have words for, and she leaned back into him and looked at the dark pasture and the stars over the mountains, and thought about the conversation that had begun at all the supper fence, the water, the pie, the Thursday nights, the careful inches of falling in love, and thought about how she had meant every word she said about not looking for a husband, and how he had meant every word he said about not looking for a wife, and how meaning something and being ready for it were not always the same thing, and how sometimes the life you needed was different from the life you thought you wanted. The years continued, as years do, not always easily but always fully. In the winter of 1886, Mabel and Theodore had their second child, another boy they named Patrick, who arrived in December in the middle of a snowstorm that kept Dr. Forrest on their side of town overnight, which turned out to be practically convenient. Patrick was, from the beginning, a different creature than James, louder, more immediately expressive, the kind of child who laughed before he could walk and had an opinion about everything from the age of 2. James was steady and thoughtful, and trailed after his father with a seriousness that was both comical and touching. Patrick trailed after his mother and kept asking why about everything, which she found exhausting and secretly excellent. The 40 acres that had been the beginning were by 1887 a proper going concern. Hay on the expanded eastern section, cattle on the south pasture that was watered by Theodore's spring, a garden that produced more than they needed, so that she had begun selling vegetables and preserves at the general store, which Dottie stocked cheerfully, and which had the side effect of Mabel developing a small but reliable second income that was entirely her own. Theodore had expanded his cattle operation to 80 head and was beginning to talk about adding a third pasture, and they spent many evenings at the kitchen table with survey maps and account books, planning the next year and the one after that, the work of building something that would outlast them and be worth passing on. Clara Depp married a young farmer from 2 towns over in the spring of 1887, and Mabel went to the wedding and watched the girl she had taught how to manage a property line and preserve tomatoes, and read a contract before she signed it stand up at the altar with the particular expression of a woman who knows exactly what she is doing and why, and felt the specific satisfaction of having passed on something useful. Horace Depp, watching the same thing, leaned over and said to Mabel in his gruff, begrudging way, "She has got a good head on her. I think that is partly your fault." "I will take the blame," Mabel said. He made a sound that was approximately a laugh, which was about the most Horace ever managed. Louis and Maria Ortega had their second child, a girl they named Esperanza, and the Ortega and Turner Walker families had by then developed the kind of friendship that was practically a family itself. The children interchangeable at mealtimes, the adults easy in each other's kitchens, the particular warmth of chosen kinship in a place far from where any of them had started. Louis still worked with Theodore on the cattle operation, though he had also by then established his own small herd, which Theodore had helped him do, because Theodore had the quality of a man who understood that other people succeeding did not cost him anything. Mabel thought about this sometimes, the ways in which the territory was both brutal and fair, the way that the injustices of the wider world showed up out here too, the barriers that Louis and Maria had to navigate that she and Theodore did not, the particular strength it required to build something in a world that was not organized in your favor, and the specific character of people who managed to do it anyway. She had learned from watching that something she hoped she had not taken too long to understand, the understanding that her own struggle to be taken seriously as a woman alone was real and costly, and that other people's struggles to exist at all in this territory were a different order of magnitude, and that both things could be true, and that seeing clearly was a form of respect. James Turner, at 8 years old, could ride well enough to be genuinely useful, had an encyclopedic interest in the mechanics of everything on the ranch, and had recently announced that he was going to be a lawyer when he grew up, which Mabel suspected came from hearing the story of the property dispute more times than was strictly necessary. Theodore had told him the story of the property survey and the territorial court, and James had found it more interesting than any story Theodore had told him, which was saying something because Theodore was a good storyteller. Patrick, at 4, had announced that he was going to be a horse, which they felt reflected his age appropriately. The summer of 1888 brought a good year. The rains came when they were needed. The herd was healthy. The hay crop was the best they had produced, and Mabel's garden was so abundant that she was trading produce as far as 2 towns over through a network of connections that had developed naturally from years of being a person who showed up and delivered what she said she would deliver. She sat on the porch one August evening, the heat beginning to ease toward nightfall, and looked at the property in the blue-purple dusk and thought about the day she had arrived here 6 years ago with her saddlebag and her grief. She was 34 now, which was the age at which life, if you had been living it properly, starts to feel like something you have got a proper grip on. The grief was old and soft-edged, the way grief becomes when it has been absorbed into the larger body of living, not gone but no longer an interruption. She was stronger than she had been at 28, not just physically, though the years of ranch work had made her capable in ways she would not have anticipated, but in the way of having survived things and proven to herself that survival was possible, and that surviving was not the same thing as living, and that she had managed to get to living, which was the harder business. Theodore came out and sat beside her with the cup of coffee she had not asked for and he had thought to bring, the particular fluency of a long partnership. Thinking, he said. Remembering, she said. He handed her the coffee. What are you remembering? The day I drove in, she said. Everything that was wrong with this place. And what do you think about that now? She looked at the house and the barn and the pasture and the mountains beyond, and thought about the boys sleeping inside and the man beside her, and the years of work that had turned the promising into the real. I think, she said, that my father was right. It was promising. Theodore smiled, looking at the same view she was looking at. He would have liked to see it, he said. He would have taken credit for it, she said. Fathers do that, Theodore said, with the warmth of a man who was now one himself. She leaned against him on the porch bench, her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her in the easy, natural way that 7 years of marriage had made second nature, and they sat in the good dark together watching the stars come out over the mountains. She said presently, I was absolutely right, you know. About what? About not looking for a husband. He turned his head to look at her. She could see the question in his expression even in the dark. I was right that I did not need one, she said, that I was not incomplete without one. That is true, I was right about that. All right, he said carefully. I was just also not expecting that what I needed and what I wanted might be two different things, she said, and that the thing I wanted might be a specific person rather than a category. He was quiet for a moment. I had the same conversation with myself, he said. Mine went on longer because I am more stubborn. You are, she agreed pleasantly. But here we are, he said, and the words had the quality of a full circle, the same ones he had said on her south fence line in the early evening with the wire pliers between them, before any of it, when they were both still being very careful about what they would admit to. Here we are, she said. It was James who, the following spring, found the letter from Theodore's old friend in California. The one about a patent on a new well-digging mechanism that would allow ranchers to access water at greater depths than the current technology allowed, and who brought it to his father with the gravity of an 8-year-old who has identified important mail. Theodore read it and brought it to Mabel, and they sat down together with the account books, as they always did, and talked it through. Whether it was the right time, whether they had the capital, what the return would look like, all the practical arithmetic of a decision made together by two people who had both earned the right to a seat at the table. They invested in the mechanism, which arrived in July and required 3 days of installation by a man who came from Albuquerque and clearly felt that he was far from anything, and which began producing water from 20 feet deeper than their current well on the 4th day, which was 20 feet deeper than anything they had been able to access before. Theodore stood at the edge of the new well with his hands in his pockets and looked at the water with the expression of a man who is very pleased about something and is being appropriately restrained about showing it. Say it, Mabel said. The east pasture, he said. We can water it now, which means we can graze it, which means we can increase the herd, which means we can, he started. Theodore, she said, I know what it means. I did the same arithmetic. He turned and looked at her with the smile she had known now for 7 years and never grown tired of. Sometimes I forget you have been thinking 2 steps ahead since the day we met. 3, she said. I am usually 3 steps ahead. At least, he agreed. He reached for her hand and she gave it, and they stood together at the edge of the new well looking at what was possible, the way they had been doing, in one form or another, since the beginning. The territory of New Mexico was moving, in those years, toward the slow and complicated business of becoming a state, which was still decades away, but which everyone talked about with the mixture of anticipation and apprehension that comes with the knowledge that the world you built your life in is eventually going to be organized differently. The frontier was not what it had been when Mabel arrived. There were more people, more towns, better roads, and the railroad had come through 30 miles to the south, which changed everything about how you moved goods and people, and therefore changed everything about how you thought about distance and time. Mabel had watched these changes with the attention of someone who understands that changes require adaptation, and she had adapted. Her vegetable and preserve business had grown substantially with the rail access, because she could now get product to Albuquerque in ways that were simply not possible before, and what had started as a small supplementary income had become something that she and Theodore agreed warranted actual accounts of its own, kept separate, and considered as a real business. She hired Clara's younger sister, a girl of 18 named Ruth, to help with the production side of things, and Ruth turned out to have a head for the numbers that her older sister had not, and they worked well together, and Mabel taught her everything she knew about both the practical business and the contractual side of it, because she had found that the teaching was something that gave her as much as it gave the people she taught. James, at 12, showed an aptitude for numbers and a serious, methodical quality that Mabel found both familiar and touching, and she had already begun what Theodore called her long game, making sure he had access to books and education in every form that was available in their reach, because she was not going to let the territory's limitations be the ceiling of her son's possibilities. Patrick, at 8, had given up the ambition of being a horse and had now announced he wanted to be a cattle rancher, which Theodore received with visible emotion, and which Mabel received with the practical understanding that this was likely and the determination that he would be a good one. The summer of 1891 brought something she had not expected, a letter from her eldest brother Daniel, the one who had been most aggressive about the inheritance dispute and who had not spoken to her since the court found in her favor. The letter was not an apology, not quite, but it was something in that direction. He had been going through their father's remaining papers and had found some correspondence that made clear their father had intended to give her the land, had written about her by name and with something like pride, and Daniel was enclosing copies of those letters. She sat at the kitchen table and read them 3 times and then put them down and was very still for a while, and Theodore came in and saw her face and did not say anything immediately, just sat down across from her and waited. She slid the letters across the table. He read them, and when he looked up his eyes were very gentle. "He knew," she said. "He wrote it down that I would do something with it. He knew his daughter," Theodore said. "She thought about this for a long time." She wrote back to Daniel, not warmly but honestly, because she was not going to be dishonest about the cost of what he had done. But she left the door the width of a crack open, because she had watched Theodore and his father spend 5 years finding their way back from something similar, and she had not closed the door herself, only declined to be the first one to knock. In the years that followed, she and Daniel would not be close, but they would be civil, and occasionally something warmer than that, and she thought this was probably as much as the history between them could honestly support, and that it was enough. Theodore's father, James Turner Sr., whom young James had insisted on calling Grandpa, and whom this name had somehow softened into the role more thoroughly than anything else could have, came back from Tennessee for a second visit in the fall of 1891, this time alone, his wife having passed the previous year. He was older and quieter, and he spent a great deal of time sitting on the porch watching the mountains, and Mabel brought him coffee without being asked, and sat with him sometimes in the comfortable way of people who do not need to fill every silence. One afternoon he said to her, out of a long quiet, "He wrote to me about you before we were introduced, in the very first letter. He said he had met a woman who knew her own mind." "That is accurate," she said. "He said it like it was the finest thing," the old man said. She looked at the mountains. "I know he did," she said. Grandpa Turner stayed for 3 months and went back to Tennessee in December with the intention of returning in spring. But he died in February, quietly in his sleep, which was the best of the possible ways, and Theodore received the news with the particular grief of a man who had made his peace with something just in time to lose it properly. He was quiet for several days, the kind of quiet that needed to be around familiar things, and Mabel kept the house full of ordinary warmth, the boys, the routine, the meals, the evenings, and she was close enough to be felt without crowding the shape his grief needed to take. He came back out of it gradually, the way grief works when there is no unresolved business in it, and the first evening he came back to himself he sat at the kitchen table with her and said, "I am glad we wrote. I am glad he saw James." "So am I," she said. "Thank you," he said, "for knowing I needed to." "You knew," she said. "I just agreed with you." He looked at her. "You said write the letter." "You already knew you should," she said. "I just confirmed it." He shook his head slightly, with the expression he had when she outmaneuvered him gently. "Mabel Walker Turner," he said. "Theodore Turner," she said. Spring came, as it always did, with the particular reliable extravagance of the territory. In April, the wildflowers coming up in the pastures, the aspens in the hills putting out their first pale leaves, the creek running high and cold from the snowmelt, the whole world smelling of green and mud and possibility. James was 13 now, Patrick 9, And the ranch was what Mabel had always known it could be: the hay operation, the cattle, the vegetable and preserve business, the two properties in practical partnership. The whole of it built from the nothing she had arrived with and the nothing he had built from, joined into something that was more than the sum of what either of them had brought alone. On a morning in late April, she stood at the window of the kitchen in the house they had built with its windows facing east, watching the sunrise come over the mountains with the particular violence of April light, and she heard Theodore come down the stairs with the familiar sound of his particular step, and then the sound of him setting the water on to boil, and then his footsteps crossing the kitchen, and then his arms around her from behind, his chin on the top of her head, both of them looking at the sunrise. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. Outside, the spring day was building itself with complete confidence. The mountains were going gold at the peaks where the early light hit them. In the pasture, the cattle were beginning to move, slow, dark shapes in the low mist. Somewhere in the hills, a bird was making the precise, clear call that only happened in early morning when the air was still perfectly quiet. She thought about the day she had ridden in with her saddlebag and her grief. She thought about the promise she had made herself, the one about never again, the one that had been entirely sincere. She thought about a man talking about fence posts in a general store, and a survey map, and a pie and Thursday suppers, and all the small precise steps by which a life becomes something different from the life you planned. She had told him she was not looking for a husband. He had said he was not looking either. And here they were, the house and the land and the boys and the life, all of it built from the extraordinary, ordinary fact of two people who had both stopped looking and found each other anyway. "What are you thinking about?" he said. "Everything," she said. "Nothing, the way this light looks. Like the first morning in the world," he said. She turned in his arms so she was facing him and looked at him, this man who was her partner in everything that mattered, who had never once tried to make her smaller, who had helped her be larger, who had understood from the beginning that her mind and her land and her name and her self-sufficiency were not obstacles to love but the specific things he had fallen in love with. "I want to tell you something," she said. "Tell me," he said. "I am glad I was not looking," she said. "Because looking for something means you have already decided what shape it will take, and you are an entirely different shape than anything I would have thought to look for." He was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was taking in something he wanted to receive properly. "I would say exactly the same about you," he said. "You are nothing like anything I imagined. You are considerably more difficult and considerably better." "More difficult," she repeated. "In the very best way," he said. She laughed, and he pulled her closer, and the morning came in through all the east-facing windows they had argued about, and she had won, and fell across the kitchen floor in long parallel strips of gold light, and outside the territory was doing what it had always done, what it had been doing before either of them came to it, going on with itself in its vast and beautiful indifference. The mountains and the sky and the creek and the pasture all fully and completely themselves, asking nothing, offering everything. Exactly as it had been on the day she arrived with a deed and a grief and a promise, and exactly as it would be long after they were gone. She was not looking for a husband. He was not looking for a wife. And here they were completely, improbably, thoroughly, and without any remaining question whatsoever, here they were.